As much as we all want to see Joshua versus Wilder as soon as possible, they both have two respective fights upcoming on the same night. Now, Joshua is facing Otto and Deontay Wilder is obviously facing Joseph Parker. Now, in terms of both guys' opponents, from a styles point of view, if Joshua and Wilder are planning on facing each other next, which I will do a separate video on that, because Otto being the opponent for Joshua has me worried for a variety of reasons. One of which is that Eddie Hearn has made no secret of the fact that one of the reasons why they chose Otto is because if they beat him, they usurp him in the rankings of the IBF, which gives them options. Now, why would you want options if you are planning on facing Deontay Wilder next? We'll talk about that in a separate video. But when you look at both fights, both respective fights, on paper, they're competitive. You know, it's not like Deontay Wilder against Robert Helenius. It's not like Anthony Joshua against Robert Helenius, where you knew going into the fight that only one guy is likely to win. Same with Joshua Franklin to an extent. You knew going into that fight that it's really a comeback fight for Joshua. With Helenius, it was a comeback fight for Wilder. They were expected to win. Out of Elaine is a much, much, much tougher task than a Robert Helenius. Likewise, Joseph Parker, right? You would say now at both points in both opponents' respective careers that, you know, both guys, Joshua and Wilder, should get through it. They should. However, this is heavyweight boxing at the end of the day, and you can never plan ahead in heavyweight boxing, as we've seen several times. I mean, we nearly seen it a couple of weeks ago with Tyson Fury, Francis Ngannou. You know, going into that fight, the whole talk throughout wasn't even, you know, oh, Fury and blah, 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 blah. About a month prior, it was announced that the Fury-Usyk fight was signed. They hadn't announced the date or anything like that, but both teams confirmed that it was all people were talking about. All the while, Fury going into an Ngannou fight, he gets dropped and taken the distance. Some people feel Ngannou won it. Had he lost that fight, I don't know if we would have had the press conference for Fury-Usyk this past Thursday. I really don't. You also have to look at, I'm going to kind of do a little bit of just talk about some of these occasions where it's happened. You look at Dillian Whyte is a very good example. Do you remember in 2020 when they announced Dillian Whyte would be facing Alexander Povetkin? Now, in the run-up to that fight, that was on Fight Camp. And the run-up to that fight, I want to say pretty much the month of that fight, when Dillian Whyte was being interviewed, all the news about Dillian Whyte, none of it had anything to do with Alexander Povetkin. Literally none of it. It was, if you didn't know the fight was coming up at the end of August, you know, you probably would have missed it. Because all Dillian Whyte talked about was getting his mandatory shot at Tyson Fury. He talked about going down legal roads. He talked about every single thing he could do about Tyson Fury next year, Tyson Fury next year, Tyson Fury next year. What happened? He got knocked out by Alexander Povetkin. And yeah, he won the rematch, but it knocked his plans back an extra year. He ended up having to wait to 2022 instead of 2021 to get that title shot. So there's an example. Joshua has come undone twice when it comes to a fight potentially in the future that likely will happen, get by an opponent, and then it will happen. Twice he's come undone. You look at 2019. In 2019, there was the Fury, Wilder, Joshua kind of three-way, where there was a rematch ordered between Fury and Wilder, but both guys took respective fights in the interim. So Fury decided to fight Tom Schwartz, and Deontay Wilder made a mandatory defense against Dominic Breazeale. All the while, Joshua was originally meant to fight Jarrell Miller, ended up having to get an opponent on short notice, got Andy Ruiz. Now, this was going to take place within roughly, I want to say, a month kind of patch. So you had Wilder Breazeale, I believe that was the first fight. Then I think it was a fortnight gap, quote me on that, I think it was a fortnight gap to Anthony Joshua, and then there was, I think, another fortnight gap until Tyson Fury. So the three protagonists at the time of the heavyweight division were all fighting within a fortnight of one another, right? Now the talk is that it could be Wilder versus Fury later on in the year, or it could potentially be Wilder Joshua. But all they have to do is win their respective fights. Wilder knocked Breazeale out in a round. Fury toyed with Tom Schwartz. That was the weakest out of the three in terms of the fights, because Tom Schwartz was just a pudding. And then Joshua had Andy Ruiz. What happened? Joshua lost. And I remember at the time, the channel was fairly new, but me and a few others were saying, you know, something like that, where you have the three of them, one after the other, that just, something about that just screams upset with one of them. Now, obviously, the most likely was Joshua against Ruiz because for the simple reason it was the most competitive out of the three. And that's exactly what happened. He lost, he had to go and rematch Andy Ruiz, so it pushed his plans back for unifying potentially with Deontay Wilder or the winner of Fury Wilder back a bit. Because he obviously had to go and regain his titles from Andy Ruiz. Then he had mandatories that were coming up, so that pushed him back a bit. But then he goes, he wins the titles back, he has his mandatory with the IBF and Kubrat Pulev, he's free to do what he wants. Fury goes and beats Deontay Wilder, has to rematch him. Now, the rematch took over a year. Right, we're over a year waiting for the rematch. So at the time, there was a lot of talk about Joshua versus Fury. And Tyson Fury even made a video where he was saying, I can't remember the Prince. It might have been the Prince with Skill Challenge, saying that, it's all good to go. I think sometime in August or something like that. And literally, you couldn't have wrote it. You couldn't have made it up. Within a day or 2 days later, it was announced. Not going to happen. Fury's going to have to fight Wilder. But then it became, okay, Fury's going to fight Wilder. Joshua's going to make a mandatory defense against Alexander Usyk. This is in 2021. And then you say, okay, when are they fighting and how's it going to go? And once they both beat their respective opponents, Wilder and Usyk, can they fight next? Because there's nothing stopping them fighting next, right? Then you hear the dates. Joshua at the end of September. And again, within a fortnight, you'd have Fury Wilder. Now, these both were a lot more competitive on paper anyway than Ruiz. Well, then, the trilogy, the three fights in 2019. The Wilder, the Fury, the Joshua. These were more competitive. Wilder, we already know. And Alexander Usyk, we already know. So both guys had to get through their respective fights and then they could fight one another. And even at the time, again, I said, look, no guarantee that one or both even get through it. Both could potentially lose. But certainly I was looking at that thinking, one's likely to lose. And I was thinking out of the two, it would likely be Joshua because it just seemed a more competitive fight on paper. What happens? Joshua goes in and he loses. So ultimately the plan for Fury versus Joshua, that went out the window because Joshua had to do what he did against Ruiz, go and rematch him, but this time he lost. So now we're in a similar situation. And that's in this kind of era. You go back to the 1990s, Mike Tyson in 1990, February 1990, Evander Holyfield is next in line to challenge Mike Tyson, who was undisputed champion at the time. He wants a run out in Tokyo, Japan. Last time he was there, he knocked out Tony Tubbs in 2 rounds. All right, so he's going over there fighting a Buster Douglas. Everyone. I remember Larry Merchant saying that he shared a flight with one of the guys who writes for one of the boxing publications. And he said he was over there to cover the Tyson Douglas fight in a conversation, I think with an air hostess or something. And they said, well, how long do you expect to work the Tyson Douglas fight? About 90 seconds. Got Holyfield ringside. Everyone was thinking Holyfield, Tyson. Buster Douglas goes and beats him. Then you're like, what the hell happens now? Does Tyson get a rematch? Does what happens? Obviously, Holyfield ended up fighting Buster Douglas. Lennox Lewis, when he was WBC champion, Tommy Morrison had just beat George Foreman for the WBO title, which at the time was more lightly regarded. Both guys signed in a unification of sort. Again, the WBO in the early 90s was a very lightly regarded title, a bit like the IBO is now. Tommy Morrison decides, have a quick, title defense against Michael Bent, who had actually lost his pro debut, looked a jaded fighter as a pro, goes in there and he gets knocked out in a round. Now, they did eventually end up fighting, but that was years after the fact. I think it was 96 they fought. You can never plan ahead in the heavyweight division. And when I look at those two fights on paper, Parker and Verlaine, out of the two, which would I say is most likely to have the upset? I would say most likely, if I had to put money on which one I think would be an upset, not that I'm saying it will be, it would probably be Joshua versus Verlaine. Because I think that Wilder will be able to find Parker. And I think Parker is in that mindset now where being heavier is better. He was 250 against Simon Keane. He looked good. He knocked out Simon Keane. And I'm worried now, is Joseph Parker going to get into that mindset where it's like, oh, bigger is better? It's not really though, is it? You were in there with a pudding. If you were 230, you would have done the exact same thing. And that's what you need to be against Deontay Wilder, because the slower you are, the more stationary you are, the harder you're going to have, the less chance you're going to have to be able to use your feet to get out of range, and the easier he's going to be able to find you. So I think, and especially considering, he's not been hit with a big shot since the Joe Joyce fight where he got knocked out. So I think Joe Parker is in for a tough night. Don't quote me on that, but I would imagine it's going to be a tough night. Valine and Joshua, I can see that being more competitive. And that will be the one I would pick. If I had to say which one do I think will be an upset, I think that will be one, if it is. Both guys should get through their respective fights, but it's heavyweight boxing, you never know. That's why we love the heavyweight division. That's why the heavyweight division is so different to other divisions. Because if you're in a situation where something similar has happened at welterweight, let's say you have Boots Ennis, right? Boots Ennis is IBF champion, Terence Crawford. Let's say he doesn't fight Errol Spence, and both guys fight, just say the Saudis put money up, both guys fight on the same card, not against each other. You have Boots Ennis versus Stanionis, and you have Terence Crawford versus Keith Thurman, we'll say, right? Both guys should win their respective fights, and you would imagine that they would. In fact, you'd be fairly sure that they would, because the skill gap at welterweight is massive, compared to heavyweight. You would assume that if Boots Ennis is firing on all cylinders, likewise Crawford, it's not even going to be particularly competitive, those fights, right? And more often than not, it isn't. Whereas a heavyweight, you just don't know. Switch off for 1 second, big right hand goes in, boom, it's over. Or you're hurt. Things are different at heavyweight. The skill gap between both respective fighters is not as big. Whereas at welterweight and the lower weights, it's massive. So that's why the heavyweight division turns these upsets on, or produces these upsets, I should say, more often than the lower weight divisions. Or, I want to say kind of from 160 above, that's where you see kind of more upsets happening as opposed to the lighter weights, because at that stage you're getting into a situation where the guys are bigger, the skill is on display is not as vast as it is lower down, and they hit a lot harder. So that is why you tend to kind of from 160 above, you see more upsets where you don't expect them. But a heavyweight is just the land where they happen. That's why you very seldom see heavyweights go through their career undefeated at the top level, because you just go in there, you make a few mistakes on the night, you underestimate a guy, or he just, finds something out of nowhere, boom, it's done, it's over. That's what happens. That's why we love the heavyweights. So that's my thoughts on the two respective fights and just my 2 cents on everything. Let me know yours. I wanted to kind of talk about examples in the past where this has happened. On paper, both guys should win. I'll be picking both guys respectively to win their fights, but you just don't know, especially when you're dealing with heavyweight boxing. You just don't know. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I'll leave it there for now. I hope you enjoyed it, people. Smash the like button if you could. Hit subscribe, of course, as always, if you haven't already.